Fact 1. Most medieval kingdoms were smaller than modern cities. The average medieval kingdom controlled territory smaller than a modern metropolitan area. What we call kingdoms were often just a few hundred square miles. England was considered large at about 50,000 square miles, while many German kingdoms were just a few valleys and some farmland. This small size meant everyone knew everyone's business, and royal authority could actually reach most subjects. Fact 2. Kings didn't actually own their kingdoms. Contrary to popular belief, medieval kings didn't own their kingdoms the way you own property. They held the land in trust from God and were expected to govern justly. The land itself was distributed to nobles who held it in exchange for military service. This feudal system meant a king was more like a CEO managing feudal contracts than an absolute owner of territory. Fact 3. Most kings were broke. Most of the time. Medieval kingdoms ran on tiny budgets by modern standards. Kings had to fund everything: wars, castles, administration, from limited sources like customs duties, rents from royal lands, and occasional taxes that required noble approval. Many kings were chronically in debt to Italian bankers or wealthy merchants, and some literally couldn't afford to feed their courts during lean years. Fact 4. Kingdoms could be inherited by women. Despite medieval sexism, women could and did inherit kingdoms. Eleanor of Aquitaine inherited one of the richest territories in France. Matilda fought a civil war for the English throne. Isabella of Castile united Spain through her marriage to Ferdinand. These weren't exceptions, but part of inheritance law. If no sons existed, daughters inherited, though they usually needed husbands to rule effectively by medieval standards. Fact 5. The Catholic Church was richer than most kingdoms. The Church owned roughly 1/3 of all land in medieval Europe and collected tithes from everyone. This made the Pope wealthier than most kings and gave the Church enormous political power. Kingdoms needed church approval for legitimacy, but the Church needed kingdoms for protection. This created constant tension between religious and secular authority. Fact 6. Medieval kingdoms had no police forces. There were no police departments in medieval kingdoms. Law enforcement was handled by local lords, sheriffs appointed by the king, or community watchmen. In practice, this meant justice was enforced by whoever had the most armed men. Crime victims often had to pursue justice themselves, leading to blood feuds that could last generations. Fact 7. 90% of the population were peasants. The vast majority of people in medieval kingdoms were agricultural laborers who never traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace. They worked land owned by nobles, paid taxes in crops and labor, and had almost no legal rights. Their lives were brutally hard: constant work, inadequate food, no medical care, and early death from disease or injury. Fact 8. Kingdoms could be bought and sold. Medieval kingdoms were treated like property and could be bought, sold, or traded in marriage contracts. Territorial exchanges were common in peace treaties. Nobles would sell their lands to raise money for crusades. Entire kingdoms changed hands through marriage dowries. The Holy Roman Empire was particularly notorious for this, with territories constantly being bought and sold like real estate. Fact 9. Most medieval kingdoms lasted less than 200 years. Political instability meant most medieval kingdoms had short lifespans. They'd be conquered, divided through inheritance, or absorbed into larger entities. The map of medieval Europe was constantly changing. What was one kingdom, one generation, might be 3 kingdoms the next, then united again under a different dynasty. Only a few kingdoms like France and England maintained continuous existence for centuries. Fact 10. Kings could be deposed by their own nobles. Medieval kings ruled with noble consent, not absolute power. If a king was incompetent, tyrannical, or just unlucky, nobles could and did depose him. Edward II of England was forced to abdicate and likely murdered. Richard II was deposed by his cousin. The threat of noble rebellion limited royal power more effectively than any constitution. Fact 11. Literacy rates were below 5%. In most medieval kingdoms, Fewer than 1 in 20 people could read. Literacy was concentrated among clergy, nobles, and some merchants. This meant power was concentrated in the hands of the literate few who could read laws, contracts, and correspondence. Most people's understanding of law and religion came through oral tradition and what they were told by authorities. Fact 12. Medieval kingdoms had no concept of national identity. People identified with their local region, their lord, or their religion, not their kingdom. A peasant in Yorkshire felt no connection to a peasant in Cornwall, despite both being English. National identity, as we understand it, didn't exist. Loyalty was personal, to your local lord, who owed loyalty to his lord, up the chain to the king. Fact 13. The king's peace. Only extended. As far as his army, royal authority was limited by practical enforcement capabilities. Remote regions were effectively lawless because the king couldn't project power there. Borderlands between kingdoms were especially chaotic, with raiders and bandits operating freely because no kingdom claimed responsibility. The king's law meant something in the capital and major towns, but remote areas were controlled by whoever had the most swords. Fact 14. Medieval kingdoms had no standing armies. Kings relied on feudal levies, nobles bringing their own armed men when summoned. This meant military power was distributed, not centralized. A king going to war would send messengers to his nobles, who'd gather their knights and soldiers and meet at an appointed location. This system was slow, unreliable, and meant kings couldn't wage war without noble cooperation. Fact 15. Most wars were about inheritance disputes. Medieval wars weren't usually about ideology or resources, but about who should inherit what territory. The 100 Years' War between England and France started because English kings claimed the French throne through their Norman ancestry. Wars of succession could last decades and devastate entire regions, while nobles fought over whose claim was more legitimate. Fact 16. Kingdoms could disappear overnight. Through marriage. A kingdom could cease to exist if its ruler's daughter married a foreign prince and the kingdom was absorbed into her husband's realm. Burgundy disappeared this way, absorbed into France and the Holy Roman Empire. Brittany maintained independence for centuries, but was finally absorbed through a marriage alliance. Strategic marriages were more effective than war for territorial expansion. Fact 17. Medieval kings traveled constantly. Kings didn't rule from a single capital, but traveled continuously between royal estates, castles, and major towns. This was partly to show royal presence and authority, partly because medieval courts consumed so much food that they'd exhaust local supplies and need to move on. The royal court was a mobile city of hundreds or thousands of people moving across the kingdom, eating everything in their path. Fact 18. Justice was brutal, and public medieval kingdoms maintained order through spectacular public violence. Executions were public entertainment. Torture was legal and common for extracting confessions. Punishments included mutilation, branding, and stocks where people could be pelted with garbage. The brutality was intentional, to terrify people into compliance through fear of what would happen if they broke the law. Fact 19. Women could own property and run businesses. Despite limited legal rights, medieval women could own property, run businesses, and manage estates, especially as widows. Many businesses were family operations where wives ran things when husbands were away. Wealthy widows controlled substantial resources and wielded real power. Women's economic role was larger than their legal status suggested. Fact 20. Medieval kingdoms were multi-ethnic and multilingual. Most kingdoms contained multiple ethnic groups speaking different languages. England had Anglo-Saxons, Normans, Welsh, and Cornish. Spain had Castilians, Catalans, Basques, and Muslims. Sicily had Italians, Greeks, Arabs, and Normans. The idea of ethnic homogeneity is modern. Medieval kingdoms were diverse, though not usually tolerant. Fact 21. Royal courts were dens of intrigue and poison. Medieval courts were incredibly dangerous for anyone close to power. Poisoning was common enough that kings employed food tasters. Nobles plotted constantly, forming factions that would support different heirs or policies. Alliances shifted rapidly. Falling out of royal favor could mean losing everything: your lands, your titles, your life. Fact 22. Most medieval castles were uncomfortable and cold. Despite their imposing appearance, castles were miserable places to live. Stone walls made them freezing in winter. Windows were small to prevent attack, making interiors dark. Privacy was non-existent. Most people slept in communal rooms. Sanitation was primitive. Toilets were holes in walls that dropped waste outside. Only the very wealthy had anything approaching comfort. Fact 23. Kingdoms had no unified currency. Multiple currencies circulated within a single kingdom. Local lords sometimes minted their own coins. Foreign currencies were common in trade. This created chaos. Every transaction required calculating exchange rates. Merchants needed expertise in recognizing legitimate coins versus counterfeits. Kings tried to monopolize currency but rarely succeeded fully. Fact 24. Medieval law was based on custom, not written codes. Most law was customary, what had always been done, rather than written statutes. Different regions had different customs, creating a patchwork of legal systems within kingdoms. Written law existed mainly in church courts in major cities. This meant law was flexible but also inconsistent and often arbitrary, depending on who was judging. Fact 25. Villages could negotiate with kings. Despite being powerless individually, villages could collectively negotiate with royal authorities. Villages would send representatives to bargain over taxes, labor requirements, or military service. Sometimes they'd refuse to comply, forcing kings to negotiate. Peasant solidarity provided surprising leverage against lords who needed the labor to make their lands profitable. Fact 26. Medieval kingdoms smelled terrible. Cities and castles reeked of human and animal waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and industrial processes like leather tanning. Streets were open sewers. People threw waste out windows. Animals lived alongside humans. The smell was so overwhelming that people carried herbs and flowers to mask it. Perfumes weren't luxury items, they were necessities. Fact 27. The Black Death killed 30–60% of European kingdoms' populations. The plague pandemic of 1347 to 1353 was the worst disaster in recorded history. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost half their populations. The economic and social disruption reshaped medieval kingdoms completely. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants negotiating power. Social hierarchies loosened. Some historians argue the Black Death ended the medieval period by destroying feudalism. Fact 28. Medieval kingdoms had surprisingly good roads. Major roads inherited from Roman times remained in use throughout the medieval period. Kings maintained roads between important cities because communication and trade depended on them. However, minor roads were terrible. Muddy tracks that became impassable in winter. Travel was slow and dangerous, with bandits preying on travelers. Fact 29. Universities were older than many kingdoms. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, predates many medieval kingdoms. Oxford, Paris, and Cambridge were established in the 12th century. These universities were international institutions where scholars from across Europe studied. They operated under church authority and were technically independent of kingdoms, though kings tried to influence them. Fact 30. Medieval kingdoms had sophisticated banking systems. Italian bankers created complex financial instruments, including letters of credit, double-entry bookkeeping, and international banking networks. The Medici Bank operated across Europe. These financial systems were more sophisticated than the governments they served. Kings relied heavily on bankers for loans, giving merchants significant political influence. Fact 31. Knights were middle class, not nobility. Most knights weren't nobles but professional warriors from middling families. They owned small estates that generated enough income to afford armor and horses. Knights served nobles in exchange for land and payment. Many worked as hired swords, fighting for whoever paid. The romantic image of noble knights was later invention. Most were just military professionals. Fact 32. Medieval kingdoms kept detailed records. Despite low literacy, kingdoms maintained extensive written records, tax rolls, legal proceedings, land transactions. These documents were kept in archives and consulted for precedent. This bureaucracy was surprisingly efficient. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, recorded every landholding in England in remarkable detail. Fact 33. Peasant revolts were common and often successful. When pushed too far, peasants would revolt, sometimes successfully. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 forced concessions from the king. Peasant armies could number in the thousands and pose real threats to royal authority. These revolts usually failed in the long term, but demonstrated that royal power had limits when peasants organized collectively. Fact 34. Medieval kingdoms had basic welfare systems. Churches and monasteries provided rudimentary social services, feeding the poor, sheltering travelers, caring for the sick. Some cities had hospitals. Guilds cared for disabled or elderly members. This wasn't comprehensive welfare, but it meant medieval kingdoms had more social safety net than often portrayed. People didn't just starve. There were institutions, however inadequate, that tried to help. Fact 35. Hunting rights were strictly controlled. Kings claimed ownership of all game animals on their lands. Peasants caught hunting could face severe punishment, mutilation, or death. These forest laws were deeply resented because peasants were starving while surrounded by game they couldn't legally hunt. Poaching was common despite harsh penalties. Robin Hood legends reflect this tension over hunting rights. Fact 36. Medieval kingdoms had complex water management cities built aqueducts, fountains, and water systems. Mills required managing water flow. Irrigation systems in Spain were inherited from Muslim rule. Managing water resources was crucial for agriculture and required cooperation between communities and royal authority. Water rights were serious legal matters that generated constant disputes. Fact 37. Jews faced discrimination, but also protection. Jewish communities in medieval kingdoms lived under restrictions: where they could live, what professions they could practice. They faced periodic violence, especially during crusades. However, they also received royal protection because kings valued them as bankers and merchants. This created a precarious existence, valued but vulnerable, protected but persecuted. Fact 38. Medieval kingdoms had no separation of church and state. Religious and political authority were completely intertwined. Kings needed church approval for legitimacy. The church needed royal protection. Bishops often served as royal administrators. This created constant tension. When church and king disagreed, which authority was supreme? Wars were fought over this question. Fact 39. Life expectancy was 30-35 years on average. This number is misleading because infant mortality was so high. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s. But so many children died that the average was dragged down. Still, life was shorter and harder. Disease, injury, violence, and malnutrition killed people at rates unimaginable today. Fact 40. Medieval kingdoms had robust trade networks. Despite political fragmentation, trade flourished. Merchants moved goods across Europe and beyond: spices from Asia, wool from England, wine from France. Trade fairs attracted merchants from across the known world. These economic connections often mattered more than political boundaries. Merchants needed stability and often pressured kings to maintain peace. Fact 41. Royal marriages were political alliances. Kings and queens never married for love but for political advantage. Marriages sealed alliances, ended wars, or combined territories. The couple often met for the first time at their wedding. These marriages created international networks of royal families all related to each other, which sometimes prevented wars, but other times caused them through competing inheritance claims. Fact 42. Medieval kingdoms used hostages to enforce treaties. When making peace treaties, kingdoms would exchange noble hostages, often children, who'd be killed if the treaty was broken. These hostages lived in relative comfort, but were essentially prisoners. This system worked because nobles valued their family members, and because breaking treaties meant your heir might be executed. Fact 43. Coronations were religious ceremonies. Not just political kings were anointed with holy oil during coronation, a sacrament that made them God's representatives on earth. This religious authority was crucial for legitimacy. Coronations required church participation, giving the church leverage over kings. An uncrowned king was vulnerable to challenges, so control of coronation ceremonies mattered enormously. Fact 44. Most medical treatment was useless or harmful. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Treatments included bloodletting, applying leeches, and administering toxic substances. Most doctors made patients worse, not better. Surgery was brutally painful and usually fatal due to infection. People often survived despite medical treatment, not because of it. Fact 45. Medieval kingdoms had surprisingly good dentistry. Barber surgeons could extract teeth and even perform basic dental surgery. Some medieval skulls show evidence of dental fillings. While far from modern dentistry, medieval practitioners understood decay and pain management. Monasteries often had monks who specialized in medical care, including dentistry. Fact 46. Kingdoms maintained extensive spy networks. Medieval espionage was sophisticated. Kings employed spies to gather intelligence on foreign kingdoms, rebellious nobles, and internal threats. Messengers could be intercepted and letters read. Codes and ciphers were developed. Spying was a crucial tool of statecraft, and kingdoms that excelled at intelligence gathering had real advantages. Fact 47. Medieval armor actually worked. Contrary to myths, plate armor provided excellent protection against swords and arrows. A fully armored knight was nearly invincible against medieval weapons, except at close range with specialized weapons like warhammers. Armor was expensive but effective. The problem was that armor couldn't protect against everything, and mounted knights became increasingly vulnerable to massed archery and pike formations. Fact 48. Kingdoms could raise massive armies when necessary. England's army at Agincourt was about 6,000 men, but English kings could raise armies of 30,000 plus when fully mobilized. France could field even larger forces. These weren't standing armies but feudal levies, but they represented significant military power. The logistics of feeding and moving these forces were immense challenges. Fact 49. Medieval kingdoms had fire departments of sorts. Cities maintained firefighting equipment and organized citizens to fight fires. This was crucial because medieval cities were tinderboxes, wooden buildings, open flames for cooking and heating, no water systems. Major fires could destroy entire cities. Some cities had regulations about building materials and fire prevention. Fact 50. Royal bastards could become kings. Illegitimate children of kings sometimes inherited thrones if legitimate heirs didn't exist. William the Conqueror was illegitimate but became King of England. Royal bastards were often given lands and titles. While legitimate children had priority, illegitimacy wasn't the complete barrier it would become in later centuries. Fact 51. Medieval kingdoms had sophisticated legal systems. England's common law system developed during the medieval period and still forms the basis of law in many countries. Legal concepts like trial by jury, presumption of innocence, and written contracts were medieval inventions. While justice was often harsh and unfair, the legal framework was surprisingly sophisticated and influential. Fact 52. Peasants worked fewer days per year than modern workers. Medieval peasants worked intensely during planting and harvest, but had slack periods during winter. Religious holidays were frequent, perhaps 150 plus days per year. While their work was physically harder, they actually worked fewer total days than modern workers. However, they had no safety net for the days they didn't work. Fact 53. Medieval kingdoms had surprisingly good communication. Royal messengers could cover 50 to 100 miles per day using relay systems with fresh horses. Important news could travel across kingdoms in days. This communication network was crucial for governance. Kings needed to know about threats, collect taxes, and enforce laws. Without good communication, kingdoms would have collapsed into chaos. Fact 54. Tournaments were brutal and often fatal. Medieval tournaments weren't friendly competitions, but violent melees where knights fought with real weapons. Deaths were common. These events served multiple purposes: military training, entertainment, and opportunities for knights to win prize money and reputation. The church tried repeatedly to ban tournaments because of the violence and deaths. Fact 55. Medieval kingdoms had zoning laws. Cities regulated what industries could operate where. Tanneries had to be outside city walls because of smell. Butchers operated in specific areas. Certain professions were restricted to certain streets. These regulations were surprisingly detailed and enforced through guild systems and city authorities. Fact 56. Royal forests covered huge portions of kingdoms. Kings declared vast areas as royal forests where only they could hunt. These weren't all wooded. The term forest meant land under forest law. In England, royal forests covered perhaps 1/3 of the country. These laws were deeply resented and were a major source of conflict between kings and their subjects. Fact 57. Medieval kingdoms had effective quarantine systems. During plague outbreaks, cities would establish quarantine stations, isolate sick people, and burn contaminated goods. Venice developed the concept of 40-day quarantine, 40 giorni. These measures weren't always effective, but showed understanding of disease transmission and public health measures. Fact 58. Literacy wasn't required for cultural participation. Oral culture was rich and sophisticated. Stories, news, and cultural knowledge spread through minstrels, storytellers, and public readings. Most people participated fully in cultural life despite being illiterate. Memory skills were highly developed because people couldn't rely on written records. Fact 59. Medieval kingdoms had rudimentary post offices. Royal courier services carried official correspondence. Merchant guilds maintained their own message networks. Universities had systems for student correspondence. While no unified postal system existed, multiple networks allowed communication across Europe. Letters took weeks or months, but did arrive. Fact 60. Kings sometimes genuinely cared about justice. Some medieval kings took their role as supreme judge seriously. Louis IX of France was known for sitting under an oak tree to hear commoners' legal cases directly. While this was exceptional, the ideal of the just king who protected the weak wasn't pure propaganda. Some kings actually tried to live up to it. Fact 61. Medieval kingdoms weren't as religious as you think. While Christianity was universal, actual religious observance varied wildly. Many people were nominally Christian but maintained pagan practices. Church attendance was required, but many attended grudgingly. Anti-clericalism was common. People resented corrupt clergy while maintaining religious belief. Medieval faith was complex and often syncretistic. Fact 62. Kingdoms maintained detailed weather records. Monasteries kept records of unusual weather, harvests, and natural phenomena. These records are now valuable for understanding medieval climate. The medieval warm period and subsequent Little Ice Age had major impacts on kingdoms. Better weather allowed population growth, worse weather caused famines and political instability. Fact 63. Medieval kingdoms had basic environmental regulations. Some cities banned certain polluting industries. Regulations controlled water usage and waste disposal. While enforcement was inconsistent and understanding limited, some environmental awareness existed. Rivers were recognized as shared resources requiring management. Fact 64. Royal household staff numbered in hundreds. Large medieval courts employed hundreds or thousands of people. Servants, guards, administrators, clergy, entertainers. These households were mobile bureaucracies that consumed enormous resources. Feeding a royal court required daily deliveries of tons of food. The logistics of moving these households were immense. Fact 65. Medieval kingdoms had sophisticated architecture. Gothic cathedrals required advanced mathematics and engineering. Medieval architects understood structural forces, weight distribution, and materials. These buildings still stand today, testament to medieval engineering skill. Cathedrals took generations to complete, but represented cutting-edge technology. Fact 66. Kingdoms sometimes went bankrupt. Royal bankruptcies occurred when kings couldn't repay loans. Edward III of England defaulted on loans to Italian banks, causing bank failures. Royal bankruptcy could destabilize entire financial systems. Lenders would cut off credit, crippling royal power. This gave bankers significant leverage over kings. Fact 67. Medieval maps were symbolic, not accurate. Medieval maps showed theological geography, Jerusalem at the center, paradise in the east. Practical navigation relied on portolan charts showing coastlines. The Mappa Mundi wasn't meant as navigation tool, but as symbolic representation of Christian cosmos. Practical knowledge and symbolic representation coexisted. Fact 68. Kingdoms maintained diplomatic relations. Ambassadors negotiated between kingdoms, though without permanent embassies. Diplomatic protocols existed for receiving foreign representatives. Treaties were written, signed, and filed. International law existed in rudimentary form. Medieval diplomacy was sophisticated, even without modern infrastructure. Fact 69. Medieval kingdoms had advanced mathematics. Arabic numerals and algebra entered Europe during medieval period. Fibonacci introduced sophisticated mathematics. Universities taught geometry and astronomy. Mathematical knowledge was practical for architecture, navigation, commerce, and theoretical. Medieval scholars made real mathematical advances. Fact 70. Kingdoms regulated weights and measures. Royal authority included standardizing measurements for trade. Kings maintained official standards in capital cities. However, local variations persisted, creating trade complications. Dishonest merchants manipulating measures was a constant problem. Regulation was attempted, but inconsistently enforced. Fact 71. Medieval kingdoms had sophisticated timekeeping. Mechanical clocks appeared in the 14th century, revolutionizing time measurement. Before that, sundials, water clocks, and canonical hours, times for monastic prayers, organized daily life. Bells announced important times. While less precise than modern timekeeping, medieval people had structured time sense. Fact 72. Royal treasuries were literal rooms, full of wealth. Medieval kingdoms stored wealth physically: gold, silver, jewels. The royal treasury was an actual treasury room, often in the most secure part of the castle. Kings could see their wealth, count it, display it. This made royal finances very concrete and limiting. You couldn't spend what you didn't physically have. Fact 73. Kingdoms had elaborate heraldic systems. Coats of arms identified families, kingdoms, and individuals. Heralds maintained records of these symbols and officiated at tournaments. Heraldry had complex rules about colors, patterns, and inheritance. This visual language communicated status and lineage instantly to those who could read it. Fact 74. Medieval kingdoms sometimes had effective queens. Regnant women who inherited kingdoms could rule successfully. Isabella of Castile, Matilda of England, and others wielded real power. While they faced additional challenges due to gender expectations, some proved highly capable rulers who expanded their kingdoms and reformed administrations. Fact 75. Kingdoms maintained royal menageries. Kings collected exotic animals: lions, elephants, bears. These menageries demonstrated wealth and international connections. The Tower of London's menagerie dated to the 13th century. These animal collections were predecessors to modern zoos and showed medieval people animals from across the known world. Fact 76. Medieval warfare had rules. Chivalric codes governed how nobles should fight. Prisoners were ransomed rather than killed. Truces and safe conducts were usually respected. While medieval warfare was brutal, it wasn't total war. Rules existed partly from Christianity, partly from practical recognition that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. Fact 77. Kingdoms experienced ice ages and warm periods. Climate variation affected medieval kingdoms dramatically. The medieval warm period, 900 to 1300, allowed agriculture to expand. The subsequent Little Ice Age caused crop failures and famines. Climate directly impacted royal power. Bad weather meant poor harvests, meaning less tax revenue and more unrest. Fact 78. Medieval kingdoms had public health measures. Cities hired physicians, maintained bathhouses, and attempted basic sanitation. Leper colonies isolated infectious people. During plague, cities established quarantines and health passes. While understanding was limited, some public health infrastructure existed. Medieval people recognized that disease spread and tried to prevent it. Fact 79. Royal genealogies were carefully maintained. Proving royal descent was crucial for legitimacy. Detailed family trees were maintained and displayed. Claims to thrones often depended on tracing lineage through multiple generations. These genealogies were sometimes fabricated or exaggerated but served important political purposes. Fact 80. Medieval kingdoms had art patrons. Kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants commissioned art, supporting communities of artists, manuscript illuminators, and craftsmen. Art wasn't just religious, but celebrated secular power. Patronage systems allowed artistic production and innovation. Medieval art was propaganda, but also genuine aesthetic achievement. Fact 81. Kingdoms maintained road networks. Major roads connected important cities and were maintained by royal authority or local lords. Bridges were built and maintained. While road quality varied, infrastructure existed to support trade and communication. Some Roman roads remained in use throughout medieval period. Fact 82. Medieval music was sophisticated. Polyphonic music developed during medieval period. Musical notation was invented, allowing preservation of compositions. Churches supported musical education. Secular music traditions existed alongside sacred music. Medieval musical theory was complex and influential on later musical development. Fact 83. Kingdoms had surprisingly modern concepts of contracts. Written contracts for property, marriage, and business were common among literate classes. Contract law was sophisticated, with concepts like breach of contract and damages. Merchant law developed to handle international trade. These legal frameworks enabled complex economic activity. Fact 84. Medieval kingdoms experienced major technological innovation. Watermills and windmills revolutionized power generation. Heavy plows improved agriculture. Stirrups made cavalry more effective. Eyeglasses were invented. Mechanical clocks appeared. The medieval period wasn't technologically stagnant, but saw major innovations that transformed society. Fact 85. Kingdoms maintained prison systems. Dungeons and prisons held criminals, political prisoners, and debtors. Conditions were terrible by modern standards, but prisons existed as distinct institutions. Some prisoners were held for years. Prisons weren't primarily for punishment, but for holding people awaiting trial or unable to pay debts. Fact 86. Medieval philosophy was highly sophisticated. Medieval scholars wrestled with complex theological and philosophical questions. Universities taught logic, metaphysics, and natural philosophy. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas created elaborate philosophical systems. Medieval intellectual life was rich and generated ideas that influenced later European thought. Fact 87. Kingdoms had rudimentary census systems. Tax collection required knowing population and resources. The Domesday Book was essentially a census. Regular surveys of royal lands tracked resources. While incomplete and intermittent, kingdoms attempted to quantify their populations and wealth for administrative purposes. Fact 88. Medieval kingdoms had active scientific inquiry. Despite religious constraints, natural philosophers studied the world. Astronomy, optics, and physics were pursued. Universities taught natural philosophy. While constrained by theological frameworks, genuine scientific investigation occurred and laid groundwork for later scientific revolution. Fact 89. Kingdoms maintained elaborate court rituals. Royal courts had complex protocols governing behavior, dress, and speech. These rituals demonstrated and reinforced hierarchy. Knowing proper court behavior marked one as sophisticated. These rituals were taken seriously, and violating them could have real consequences. Fact 90. Medieval kingdoms had international students' universities attracted students from across Europe. Oxford and Paris had Italian, German, French, and English students studying together. This created international networks of educated elites who shared common intellectual culture despite coming from different kingdoms. Fact 91. Kingdoms sometimes had effective bureaucracies. Despite popular image of chaotic medieval governments, some kingdoms had sophisticated administrations. England's exchequer managed finances efficiently. Records were kept meticulously. Professional administrators managed routine governance, allowing kingdoms to function even with incompetent kings. Fact 92. Medieval kingdoms had consumer protection laws. Guilds regulated product quality. Cities had inspectors checking weights and measures. Fraud was punished harshly. While enforcement was inconsistent, recognition that markets needed regulation existed. Consumer protection wasn't modern invention, but had medieval precedents. Fact 93. Kingdoms maintained. Lighthouse systems. Coastal kingdoms built lighthouses to protect shipping. These were maintained by royal authority or religious orders. Maritime trade was crucial for coastal kingdoms, and lighthouses represented infrastructure investment. Medieval lighthouses served same purposes as modern ones. Fact 94. Medieval kingdoms experienced religious diversity. Before standardization efforts, local religious practices varied significantly. Saints' cults were regional. Liturgical practices differed between areas. While unified by Catholic doctrine, medieval Christianity was more diverse in practice than often recognized. This diversity created richness, but also conflict. Fact 95. Kingdoms had elaborate inheritance laws. Primogeniture, where eldest son inherited everything, was common, but not universal. Some regions practiced partible inheritance, dividing estates among children. These laws shaped family dynamics and political structures. Inheritance disputes generated constant legal cases and occasionally wars. Fact 96. Medieval kingdoms had professional entertainers. Minstrels, jugglers, and performers traveled between courts and towns. These entertainers transmitted news, stories, and culture. Court jesters held regular positions. Entertainment was professionalized, with recognized performers earning livings from their skills. Fact 97. Kingdoms maintained granaries for famine relief. Some kingdoms stored grain to distribute during famines. This was partly charity, partly self-interest. Starving populations couldn't pay taxes or provide soldiers. Grain storage wasn't systematic, but represented understanding that food security mattered for political stability. Fact 98. Medieval kingdoms had surprisingly mobile populations. Despite myths about peasants never leaving their villages, people moved more than expected. Pilgrimages took people across Europe. Workers migrated seasonally. Merchants traveled extensively. Crusades moved huge numbers. Medieval society was more mobile than often portrayed. Fact 99. Medieval kingdoms ended, not with a bang, but through gradual transformation. Medieval kingdoms didn't end suddenly, but evolved into early modern states. Centralization increased. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Gunpowder rendered castles obsolete. National identity emerged. The transformation was gradual, with medieval and modern elements coexisting for centuries. Medieval kingdoms shaped modern Europe's political geography, legal systems, and cultural identity in ways still visible today.